When I look at the global economy, and I also specialize in financial crisis, I take a non-ideological and pragmatic approach. There is not one theory, Keynesian, Austrian, monetary, or otherwise, that explains everything at all points in time. So you have to be, first of all, intellectually flexible. Secondly, people ask, how did you predict the global financial crisis or even other financial crises in emerging markets and in advanced economies over the last 20 years? And usually I think of financial crises as being what I refer as white swan events, to relate them to the idea of a black swan that my good friend Nassim Taleb expressed in his book on black swans. Black swan is an event that is surprising, that occurs with a tail risk that you cannot predict in advance, something like an earthquake or like a tornado. Instead, I think of financial crises being white swan events because they're not random events like a tornado or an earthquake, but they're usually the result of a build-up of economic, financial, policy vulnerabilities that eventually reach a tipping point and lead to a currency crisis or a banking crisis or a sovereign debt crisis or a household or corporate or a broader financial crisis. So they're not random events, they cannot be predicted, but a range of factors that you can measure in advance lead you to make the assessment that there's a build-up of vulnerabilities that eventually is going to lead to such a financial crisis. Crises can occur for a number of reasons. One is also being intellectually inflexible and not being open-minded to think about the kind of tail events. Secondly, you have to have an eclectic approach to this thing. Third, I would say most textbooks of economics don't talk about crises, they talk about the normal business cycle. There maybe a chapter or a section of a chapter about crisis. I wrote an entire book titled Crisis Economics. Why crisis economics usually talk about micro or macro or international economics, because these events are occurring much more frequently in advanced economies and emerging markets, so understanding the causes of them is also important. Finally, there is a bit of a political economy of crisis, because before a crisis there is always an asset and a credit bubble. And during a bubble, everybody believes the bubble can continue forever. Like during the housing boom in the United States, people believed wrongly that home prices could go up 20% every year. So households were living in a bubble, spending more than their income and using their mortgages as ATM machine. Politicians were happy because the economy was booming and they're getting reelected. Regulators were asleep at the wheel. Banks and credit rating agencies were making billions by essentially creating toxic instruments. So whenever there is a bubble, everybody lives in a bubble and doesn't realize that actually there is a build-up of vulnerabilities that eventually is going to lead to a bust and a crash following this boom. We live in an interdependent world where what's happening to China affects Chile and Latin America. Now, since China is now the second largest economy in the world in terms of its overall GDP, whatever happens to China matters because of the trade and financial links between China and the rest of the world. What happens in the United States affects the world, but also what happens in Syria and Iraq can affect economic and financial markets. So I would say having a macro view, top-down of what's happening in US, in Europe, in Japan, in China, in the rest of the BRICS emerging markets, how all these global economies linked, how no country nor market is an island, gives you the top-line view. So that even if you spend your day trading Brazilian bonds or oil futures or stocks of a particular tech sector in the US or otherwise, you have to have that broader view that is the top-down macro and global to understand those kind of global shocks that can affect your business, your investment, your savings, your financial decisions. That's why it's important to have sufficient amount of economic and financial literacy.